you.
Back in 1987, when the NES was at the peak of its reign, the video game world was not yet ready for the open-world urban crime adventure. But today, a quarter century later, Retro City Rampage lets you experience what the genre might have been like if it had been introduced on that now primitive platform. In some ways, it's not quite faithful enough to the games of the era that inspired it, and in other ways, it's a little too faithful. But all in all, Retro City Rampage is an enjoyable experience in which old meets new to create something both fresh and familiar. In RCR's story mode, you play as Player, a low-ranking henchman in a supercriminal's army. Following an introductory series of stages that references The Dark Knight, Mario Bros., Mega Man 2, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Super Mario Bros. 2, Back to the Future, and much more, you're set free in the city of Theftropolis to spend your time as you see fit. Theftropolis doesn't seem like a nice place to live, but it is a pleasure to look at, particularly if you have a soft spot in your heart for 8-bit worlds. The pixelated residents of Theftropolis are a wonderfully diverse bunch. Despite being quite tiny, they have a good deal of personality thanks to their vibrant colors, their big hair, and their expressive animations as they strut down the street, breakdance, or otherwise pass the time. The city has at least as much personality as its residents. Everywhere you look, there are references on shop signs and billboards to 80s video games and other pop culture artifacts. For that extra dose of nostalgia, an impressive assortment of visual filters lets you make the game look as if it's running on a wide range of 80s gaming and computer hardware, and the catchy 8-bit music would have been right at home in an NES game. Unfortunately, getting around Theftropolis isn't always enjoyable. Player moves a bit sluggishly until he gets a bit of momentum going, and although all the vehicles around you are yours for the taking, many of them are too slow to be much fun to drive. Still, there are some speedy little numbers to cruise around in. The story mode's 62 stages often reference specific games in their structure, but this ends up being a liability. One mission is modeled on Paperboy, for instance, but the controls don't feel anything like Paperboy. They feel like Retro City Rampage, so the mission doesn't actually capture the feel or the fun of Paperboy. Players who are too young to remember Paperboy won't get any joy from the reference, and players who do remember Paperboy will be frustrated by the way the gameplay fails to capture what actually made Paperboy enjoyable. That's a recurring issue throughout Retro City Rampage's story mode. And like many 8-bit games, RCR's difficulty is erratic and sometimes unfair. The faithfulness of such difficulty issues to games of the 8-bit era doesn't make them any more welcome here. When it sticks to simple rampaging and havoc-wreaking, Retro City Rampage is goofy, cathartic fun. There's an enjoyable variety of guns and melee weapons to use, and wild power-ups like speed shoes keep the action pleasantly absurd. And outside of the story mode, there's a good deal to do that benefits rather than suffers from RCR's retro trappings. There are secrets aplenty to discover, which makes exploring Theftropolis a rewarding pursuit. There are simple but fun arcade games to play that reward you with content bonuses if you do well. You can compete for a high score on the leaderboards on dozens of quick pick-up-and-play challenges, and more. Retro City Rampage is a good amount of game for your $15, and if you're old enough to remember the 80s, its shortcomings will be outweighed by the pleasures of jacking cars, spotting references, and discovering secrets in its enticing 8-bit city. It's appropriate that there are so many time travel references in Retro City Rampage. Like the cold response Marty McFly got from his failed attempt to introduce 80s-style guitar licks to the people of the 1950s, a game like Retro City Rampage might have been too much for players of the 1980s to handle. But now, its time has come, and it's well worth experiencing, warts and all.